Every generation of video game consoles has a few buzzwords that can summarize it best, concepts and ideas that made it special or unique. The first generation was the pioneer generation where everything started. It was a quaint generation without which the medium does not exist. The second generation is what I like to call the Enlightenment generation, where many aspects of game consoles that would remain to this day, though primitive in their delivery, were initially standardized. This generation introduced a more standard cartridge format and graphical capabilities that could actually produce the entire game without the need for putting any sort of plastic overlays on your TV screen, and more complex computational abilities which allowed them to actually port arcade games, which was kind of a big deal. The third generation is what I like to call the rebirth generation, riding on the back of the crash that ended the previous one. There were a number of moderately successful consoles at this time, but the undisputed champion was the Nintendo Entertainment System, offering games of dramatically greater scope and visuals than you would ever see on the Atari 2600. The fourth generation might have been the first time competition between game companies could actually be considered a competition, and not just one guy feasting while the rest fight for table scraps. This is when video games became art, we had Super Metroid, Link to the Past, Sonic 3, Chrono Trigger. These games are older than the first fish that crawled out of the water, and people still remember them fondly, which is probably why they call it the Golden Age. The fifth generation can best be summarized as the 3D era. Consoles could render 3D visuals that actually resembled what they were supposed to represent, kinda. And every single game series had to at least try to go 3D. It was an age of experimentation, and not every game from this gen aged as gracefully as the previous one, but it saw numerous dramatic evolutionary steps in terms of game design and graphical innovation. Gen 6 is what I like to call the modern generation because many of the imperfections of the 90s era 3D games were slowly ironed out, and many of the standardized control schemes and game design sensibilities that we've gotten used to started here. This generation saw consoles begin to get comfortable with online gaming, with the PS2 network adapter, the Xbox Live service, and the GameCube modem, which was supported by 3 video games that most people probably didn't even own. Gen 7 started experimenting with motion controls and HD resolutions, but I call it the broadband generation since it was really the aggressive expansion of online functionality that defined it to me. Not only online play, but also patches and DLC becoming far more commonplace, which may have been a curse as much as a blessing, but was very influential nonetheless. Generation 8 saw the further integration of social media, allowing users to share gameplay clips on Shitter and GooberTube, while also making big leaps for accessibility. Which brings us to the current generation, 9. Now what makes this generation so special? Well, the games load really fast, so I guess you could call it the fast generation. Not just because of the SSDs, but also because it's already coming to a close even though it feels like it barely even started. This generation has been possibly the most bizarre and frustrating generation for video games that I have seen in my lifetime. This is a generation that feels like it barely even began, when in reality it's already halfway through its lifespan. My experience with this generation felt like waiting for something but not really knowing what it is, and then feeling like I may never know because it never actually materializes. In one review of The Last of Us Part 1, that is the PS5 remaster of the PS3 game that already had a great remaster on the PS4, which the PS5 is already entirely backwards compatible with, the reviewer describes the game by saying,
"There is something inherently inessential about it."
And when looking at the current gaming landscape, I struggle to find a word in my broad vocabulary that better summarizes this generation in my eyes. The Last of Us Part 1 really is a perfect analogy. It's the same old shit with somewhat impressive but often superficial improvements, and it costs way more money. That's what this generation feels like to me. It's a generation with much of the same old crap, with advancements that are kinda cool but not really necessary, and they cost way more money. As of today, I feel strongly that this is the Inessential Generation, and I get the sense that I'm not alone. Let's take innovations out of it for now. The most definitive feature of every generation is games, even back to the earliest days. What's the first thing I think of for the first generation? Pong machines.
There is another one.
What's the first thing I think of for the second generation? Space Invaders and Yar's Revenge. I like Yar's Revenge. When I named each generation in the intro, I was using broad descriptors and I only mentioned the actual games sparingly. But I mean, who could forget such groundbreaking classics as 3 for the Odyssey? In previous generations, there would be at least 5 or 6 games that I really wanted that I couldn't get on previous gen hardware by this time. And you know, that's the stuff that makes me buy the console. I bought a Nintendo Switch because Super Mario Odyssey was on it. I bought a PS3 years after it dropped because it's the only place I could play Metal Gear Solid 4. Not to mention a whole bunch of great multi-platform games that were also on the system at the time, and yeah, I know they often ran better on 360 and always ran better on PC, but they ran well enough on the PS3 that I felt very justified in buying it back then. Especially when the price was way down by that time. Back then, if I didn't get the new console when it actually dropped, I usually got it a few years later when its library is more competitive and the price had gone down, which brings us to PS5. 3.5 years on the market, there are exclusives that look nice, but nothing is really blowing my back out, and it still hasn't had any price cut that I'm aware of. As a matter of fact, I'm pretty sure they actually raised the price in some regions, those son of a bitches. Way back in 2017 though, I did manage to build a mid-range gaming PC that I still use today. I'm talking 1070, 7700K, 32 gig RAM. It's dated hardware today, but I wonder how big of a deal that actually is sometimes. My computer may not be able to run every single modern game very well, but how many of those modern games will I actually miss? Even the modern games I do like, they're often cross-generational and the advantages of playing on new hardware are nice, but again, inessential. Especially if it's a well-optimized PC game that doesn't make my 2017 hardware choke. Now let me be clear, if we are to mark the release of the PS5 and Series X as the start of the new generation, there were definitely games since then that I loved a lot. There was Armored Core 6, Elden Ring, Lies of P, Pikmin 4, Mario Wonder, Metroid Dread, Metroid Prime Remaster, Mario RPG Remake, Bowser's Fury, Kirby Forgotten Land, Tears of the Kingdom. There have been a lot of great titles since this generation started. Although 70% of those are Nintendo Switch games and half of those are re-releases. Then the other 30% are available on PS4 and still run perfectly fine on my 2017 computer. Even Cyberpunk, which launched in a busted up state, still ended up being surprisingly compelling upon subsequent playthroughs, especially now that the game actually kinda works. Granted, that's me playing on computer. PS4 version probably still sucks ass, but you knew that. But let's think for a second. Which games can my computer possibly not play? Starfield, Forspoken, Redfall, and I guess by some definition, Saints Row 5? Ooh, you gotta upgrade your PC or get a new console. Think about all the stuff you're missing.
Brunch is a time for friends and mimosas, not debates on morality.
Yeah, I'm good. There are good games that are currently out of my reach, but none of them are games that I'm actually dying for. They're more like games that look like I would enjoy them if I played them, but not enough to throw my credit card in their general direction. None of these are gateway exclusives to me, you know, the kind of games that are so good that I would buy an entire console just to play them. They're games that I might get if I already owned the console thanks to some other gateway exclusive that came previously. But I don't own these new consoles because those gateway exclusives don't exist. And to be clear, the inherently subjective nature of this topic is not lost on me. I'm just speaking from the heart. For me personally, nothing here says buy a PS5 now or die. Metal Gear Delta is a game I never thought they'd make, but from what I understand, the game is largely fundamentally unchanged from the HD version of MGS3, and considering that already comes on Volume 1 of the collection, which is already out, it's hard not to compare it to The Last of Us Part 1. There is like one game that would get me to upgrade, and that's GTA 6, a game that is not out yet and probably won't come to PC until a year after the initial release, and it will probably be very poorly optimized because Rockstar is the devil. Right now, this is the game I buy a PS5 for, but damn, if they mess this up, that's gonna be a Joker moment. I feel like if PS5's games are not on PS4, then they're often PS5 games that might as well be PS4 games because they're extremely similar to ones that already exist. I mean, there are definitely exceptions to that, but as it currently stands, I look at the PS5 broadly as the console that you buy because they stopped putting Call of Duty on PS4. And you know what's messed up? I previously thought of the PS5 as the console to buy if I had to buy a console, simply because I expected them to actually put out compelling exclusives like they did for PS4. But the more I look at it, I can't really justify it that much more than I can justify a Series X. In fact, if I'm just getting GTA 6, the Series X might even be the better option because it has more teraflops, so they tell me. It is worth noting that there was a rumor that Xbox was just gonna quit this year and just put all their shit on PS5, and I believed it. Like a complete dumbass, I fully believed it. They literally had to hold an impromptu direct to dispel the rumors, which they only did partially because some games actually did come to PS5, like Sea of Thieves. Of course, when they're not porting their own stuff to other platforms, they're shutting down all the studios that they spent all that big money on. Literally, as I was finishing up the script for this video, they shut down 4 studios, which were part of the already controversial ZeniMax acquisition, one of which developed Hi-Fi Rush, which is a game that I must confess I still haven't played, but from what I understand, it's supposed to be one of the best games they've had in years.
We love supporting creative endeavors across our studios, regardless of size.
Don't lie to me.
One of my favorite games in the last 5 years was Doom Eternal, but instead of wondering how they could top that, I'm now wondering if that's the high note that the Doom franchise can afford to end on, because I don't know necessarily that id Software is any more safe from getting the boot than those other guys. While I have no particular love for Xbox and certainly not Microsoft, letting PlayStation rule the seas unchallenged could have disastrous consequences. PlayStation has already been canceling projects and shutting down studios themselves, but when their competition is also shutting down all their studios and canceling all their projects, what incentive do they have to even pretend to be a good company? Well, if Xbox really does die, they'll have even less incentive with no competition at all. So in case any of you are wondering why I play so many ROM hacks, this is why. Xbox could fail me, PlayStation could fail me, but a dude slamming Monster Energy while putting Touhou music in Mario 64? Never in a million years. But what about Nintendo? Well, they kinda do their own thing, right? They're still on the Switch 1, which dropped in 2017, 3 years before the Penis 5 and Series S Definitive Edition 4.7 to the power of n log n over 2xe.exe. Even when it came out, it never felt right to call this thing next gen. We still have no real specifics on Switch 2 and whether or not it will be garbage, although they did announce that there will be a future announcement of a successor. That's right, they made an announcement to announce a future announcement. Even though we knew this was coming eventually, they've still been putting out compelling games for the Switch 1 ever since this new generation began. Of course, again, a lot of those are remakes and re-releases, but at least they were necessary ones, at least I think. The Nintendo strategy may actually be a blessing in disguise. An interesting observation I've seen from people who are a lot smarter than me is that Nintendo releasing this super underpowered hardware that can't put out 8K octodecimal ray-traced quadrilateral tera-aliasing gigapixels per milligram is actually a cleverly disguised advantage. Obviously it's cheaper, which is always a win, but it goes deeper than that. The thing about these super powerful consoles, especially in this generation, is that there is a lot of pressure on developers to make the games look extremely hyper-realistic and detailed and to really max out these otherworldly alien processors to make the most beautiful, graphically intense game ever made, which is why when Halo Infinite used fewer than 900 polygons on an orange, the entire game looked like it had the worst graphics in the entire world. Even at the bleeding edge of modern graphics, I often find myself very underwhelmed because at this point, it's starting to look like we're splitting hairs, you know what I mean? The incredible graphics are great for marketing, which has always been very superficial by nature, you know, marketing often relies entirely on the visual component, especially for video games which have no way of demonstrating how it feels to play to somebody who doesn't own it, so obviously, selling a game on the graphics often seems to be the default approach. Of course, that's for appealing to the most general goober audiences possible and not necessarily the niches within the gaming community. And that's another thing. I feel like a lot of these companies have this apex fallacy delusion that all of their games should be selling Call of Duty numbers and that there's some mystery force preventing them from doing that, which is why when they dump all that money into a game and it does well but not Call of Duty well, they flip the table and fire everybody.
Nobody do something this crazy just for money.
Games have not only been getting way more expensive and requiring bigger budgets, but they also require way more man hours to actually put together. A problem that kinda just seems to perpetuate every single generation to no real end. Although there are some out there that speculate this generation is the breaking point at which the model is no longer sustainable. And of course the only reasonable course of action now is to fire 10,000 people and close their studios. Games are taking longer to make and they're getting way more expensive to make, so they have to make sure that it makes a ridiculous amount of money to make back that massive time and money investment, which is why they keep aggressively expanding the monetization practices of those games, which stings a lot more when the game isn't even that great to begin with. But because the Nintendo Switch is using this baby hardware, that means games can never achieve anywhere near the level of graphical prestige of a PS5 or even a PS4 game. The upside of this is that teams don't have to work for 300 years just to make the game look super pretty, and can instead focus their efforts on making games that are legitimately fun, while still putting out games on a relatively healthy schedule. And don't get me wrong, there were definitely some dry spells for the Switch, but I never felt like I blew money on a plastic paperweight. While I was doing research for another video, I came across a quote from Hiroshi Yamauchi talking about the development of Mario 64, where he basically said that you can rush a product out the door, but people are going to notice that it's been compromised. So when Miyamoto requested an additional 2 months of development time, Yamauchi gave them to him unconditionally. This is an excellent mentality that Nintendo seems to have gotten reacquainted with in recent years. There are obviously exceptions to that still, but keep in mind, they delayed Tears of the Kingdom by an entire year just to make sure all the physics worked properly, and I think the results speak for themselves. And from what I understand, Super Mario Bros. Wonder allegedly had no deadline whatsoever, and that was one of my favorite games last year. So what am I looking forward to now? Well, if we're talking 2024, my most anticipated game right now is Thousand Year Door, which comes out in 2 weeks. This is yet another remake, this time of a GameCube game from 2004, but considering it's not a game that is otherwise available on any modern device, I wouldn't call it inessential like Last of Us or even Metal Gear Delta. But there's also the indie scene, which should never be ignored. For instance, Animal Well, which comes out today, being published by Video Game Donkey. That's right, the fate of the entire video game medium right now rests on the shoulders of Donkey.
I'm a millionaire at this point. I can make any game I want. Kill ass fuck. My first M-rated game.
God help us all. I guess the takeaway from all of this is that Nintendo fans were right all along, and that despite being a bad company, they're still the only company that actually makes good video games. Okay, no. But really, perhaps the issue is that the endless, boundless, and frankly directionless growth approach is misguided and can only lead to misery, mediocrity, and a bunch of YouTubers using big words like inessential to sound smart. And what can we do about this? They say we're listening, but they don't really act like it. They say vote with your wallet, but half the time the thing I want isn't even on the proverbial ballot. The bottom line is, without incredible exclusive software, your $600 video game hardware is inessential by all definitions. But I'd be very happy to buy one when I start seeing games that I do care about. I will buy a Series X when I see Banjo-Kazooie, and I'll buy a 4090 when I win the lottery. But for now, I'll save my $600 for something that actually is essential. Like a giant box of pepperoni.